Former US President Ronald Reagan once said, "Recession is when a neighbor loses his job. Depression is when you lose yours." Or in simple words, depression is a more severe economic crisis than a normal recession. And one of the most severe economic crises the world has ever witnessed was the Great Depression of 1930. When the unemployment in the US had suddenly risen from around 3% to as high as 25%, and the US GDP had contracted by more than 30%, meaning a growth rate of minus 30%. That is when the renowned economist John Maynard Keynes, who is also known as the father of macroeconomics, suggested that if an economy has to come out of any such crisis, then the government must increase its spending to boost the consumer demand. Even if the government has to borrow or increase its fiscal deficit to finance these expenditures, there is nothing wrong in that. In fact, they must borrow money from wherever they can and do whatever is required to increase the consumer demand. Because once the demand increases, it will result into increased production and in turn increased employment and increased income, which would then result into further increase in the demand and production and income and so on and so forth. And soon the economy will be out of the recession. And due to this increased income and in turn increased tax collections, the government would also be in a position to repay whatever money it had borrowed for all that spending. This strategy of reviving the economy by reigniting the consumption demand in case of any recessionary situation is a well-tried and tested strategy and has helped the world economies come out of not only the Great Depression of 1930 but also all the subsequent recessions thereafter. No wonder this is precisely the strategy which was followed by majority of the economies worldwide, including USA, of course not India, to deal with the pandemic-induced recession as well. So the obvious questions are, what strategy did India follow and why? Why did India adopt an altogether different strategy? What was so different about pandemic-induced economic recession from all the previous recessions? Something which Indian policymakers could sense and others could not. And why this so-called foolproof strategy adopted by US and other countries simply backfired, despite the fact that their governments had spent a huge sum of money, as can be seen from their fiscal stimulus packages. For instance, the US spent 26% of their GDP, Japan 53%, Germany 34%, UK 18%. And compare this with just 3.5% of GDP spent by India. In fact, these countries, including the USA, have also credited money directly into the accounts of their citizens with an objective to revive the consumer demand by putting more money in their hands and in turn achieve the economic growth. But now when we look at all the major macroeconomic indicators, it shows a completely different picture. In fact, it is India which has emerged as the fastest growing economy among all the large economies of the world and has also overtaken UK recently to become the fifth largest economy in the world. Whereas countries like the US and even China are struggling with their economic growth. Not only that, due to their increased government spending, the money supply in these countries have also increased. And since more money means lesser value of money, means inflation. So these countries are also struggling with the problem of inflation as well. In fact, inflation in the US is hovering around its 40-year high level. Although in India also currently the inflation is around 6.7%, which is on a slightly higher side than the government prescribed ideal range of 2 to 6%. But this is not that bad. Okay, another macroeconomic indicator which reconfirms India's growth story is its highly encouraging GST collection data. Long story short, we should be thankful to our policymakers who didn't follow the world blindly and did what they thought was the right thing to do. But the question is, what exactly did they do differently? And the answer is, while most of the countries in the world focused on demand side, India decided to focus on supply side. Except for that free food and some dole-outs or direct benefit transfers in the accounts of farmers or some poor people. Otherwise, there were no big bang demand focused policies like putting any kind of helicopter money directly in the accounts of citizens or anything of that sort. So the next obvious question is why? Why didn't India try to revive the demand and focused mainly on supply side? So the logic behind this was very simple, as is explained by none other than Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal himself, the then Principal Economic Advisor to Government of India and now Member of Economic Advisory Council to Prime Minister. And I have provided the link of his complete interview in the description section below. And the logic which Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal has explained in this interview is this. During pandemic, people were so scared of the uncertainty all around at that time that even if the government had given any money in the hands of citizens, they would have saved it as nobody was in a mood to consume. Secondly, even if somebody wanted to consume, he could not because the entire country was in total lockdown. Therefore, the government focused on supply side through various measures like loan moratorium, loan restructuring, PLI, that is production linked incentive scheme, and all the incentives towards Atmanirbhar Bharat, etc. The idea was to keep the businesses alive and not let them shut down permanently, so that when the economy unlocks, we should not land up in an awkward situation wherein the demand resumes but there is no supply. It looks like this strategy has worked really well for India, given the revival in the growth and the improved tax collections we are witnessing. If we look at this in retrospect, it sounds like such a simple common sense. But as we all know, the problem with common sense is that it is so uncommon. And the fact that our policymakers could think on those lines without having any such precedent in the recent history is something that deserves the appreciation of all of us. Thank you.